Good morning, and probably good afternoon and good evening and good night, everyone. Welcome. Could everybody hear me right? Okay, sounds good. My name is Jayo Choi. I'm a doctoral student in strategy at the Warren School, and I'm delighted to welcome you all here to the PDW on organization design from finding ideas to publishing papers, sponsored by the STR division at AOM. It is unfortunate that we weren't able to physically meet at the annual conference due to the pandemic, but we are excited to be part of the STR division Stronger Together initiative and deliver this virtual workshop to all of you today who's joining from various parts of the world. Thank you all for making the time to participate in our PDW today. With the strike of the pandemic and its unfolding, I think it's not an exaggeration to say that the topic of organization design has ever become so important. I think under this new environment, we're seeing so many organizations struggling to find an effective design for their organization and also for their businesses. However, as business scholars, I think we have limited understanding and answers for these organizational designers. Although this PDW isn't, about designing organization in the pandemic era, I'm sure that many of you might be interested in that matter, and that there may be some interesting discussion about it in the open discussion later on. That said, I hope this workshop could deliver an opportunity to learn from the leading minds on organization design, on how to conduct research on this important topic, and also encourage you to make strides on advancing our understanding of designing better organizations. Today, we have 4 amazing panelists who would share their invaluable experience on doing research and publishing papers on organization design. Our first panelist, JP Eggers. Thanks for joining us, JP. We'll talk about developing modeling papers. He will introduce his recent study, which he's modeling as a method, and discuss about the specific challenges he faced during his publication process. Our second panelist, John Eklund, who is also one of the organizers of this workshop, will be presenting about collecting detailed data on organizational structure. I had a chance to see his material today, and I think it's going to be an interesting presentation. Our third panelist, Daniel Kim, will be introducing a multi-method approach to study organizational structure, discussing about how to use and combine field and lab experimental designs to address core questions on organizational structure. And our last panelist, Maggie Zoll, will be talking about the challenges for empirical research on org design and how we may overcome the old and new challenges with clever research designs. I should let you know that unfortunately, Viva Gaba will not be able to join us today due to personal circumstances. However, I should let you know that Professor Gaba has recently published an article in the Annals on org design, which based on an extensive literature review synthesizes various streams of org design research and introduces a new roadmap for advancing future research. For those of you who probably joined this PDW because of Viva's name, let me paste the link to her research on the chat so that you could get to see what she might have told us in this PDW. Hopefully, we may be able to invite her back in this PDW next year. Aside from myself and John, we have 2 more organizers on this PDW, Daniel Albert and Ronnie Lee. Throughout the workshop, Ronnie will be helping us on the background, collecting questions and comments, and Daniel will be moderating the final discussion and concluding the workshop with some final remarks. Thanks to both of you guys. To give you a brief on our schedule today, for the next 60 minutes, we will first have presentations by the 4 panelists, each having 15 minutes of airtime for both presentations and short Q&As. So panelists, I hope you are aware of this time plan, and I'll be your time police today, so please watch out when I give you time warnings. And after the presentation, we would like to have a quick open Q&A discussion session to discuss about some questions and comments raised during the presentations. So participants, I hope you make sure to submit your comments and questions, not only through the chats during the presentations, but also during this Q&A time. I'll make sure to, point you out if you raise your hands during this Q&A time. And after the Q&A, we will split into 4 breakout rooms, each hosted by the panelists. And this breakout session will last about probably about 15 minutes. And the panelists and participants would probably have a better chance to talk to each other and have closer interaction. So I hope you could use this time effectively. And finally, in the last part of the workshop, we will have all of you back in one room and have a final discussion about some interesting threads that was discussed in the breakout rooms. And lastly, we will conclude by having an online photo shoot later on for the STR division. All right, so without further ado, let's get started. And JP, so the screen is yours.
All right. Thank you all very much. Right, I did unmute myself here.
Yep, we could hear.
There we go. Sorry, when you go to screen share, you lose the little microphone thing, or at least it's there at the top. Thanks everyone. Thanks Jeho. Thanks everybody for the organizers, and thanks everybody for being here. I know in some ways this makes the trip a little easier, but to be doing it via Zoom. But obviously, you know, there's other competing demands for our time at this point in time. So. As was mentioned, I'm going to talk about org design and from a modeling perspective based upon, so I'm going to focus most of my comments kind of coming from a recent paper that I wrote with two fantastic colleagues, Oliver Bowman at Southern Denmark and Neil. And it was recently published in ASQ in 2019, and it's a modeling paper, and I'll walk through it in a second. Some of my other comments will also be drawn from a previous modeling paper with Felipe Chazar that came out in Management Science a while back as well. But before I dive into talking about kind of some of the challenges we faced, let me talk briefly about the paper, just to kind of give you enough to understand kind of what it is that we were trying to do, or hopefully enough. So what we were interested in with this paper was looking at how upstream social comparisons between divisions in multi-division firms affect kind of outcomes for the firm. And so what I mean is not necessarily the downstream competition between different product divisions, though we do model that as well, but the real piece we were focusing on was there are these two divisions who benchmark their performance versus one another. Maybe that's to get resources, maybe it's to get promotions, maybe it's because the firm uses a GE style model and tries to kind of force competition between them, any number of ways to do it. The basic model structure is the headquarters allocates resources to the units search based upon kind of their performance, prior performance that kind of guides their search, and then that search outcomes are aggregated back to the headquarters level in that case. And as I said, it's a computational or a simulation model that's based off of some other models, but kind of custom built for the paper. So it's not a straight NK or multi-arm bandit or something like that kind of a model. Now, the basic finding of the paper is that these social comparisons between business units can actually be good for firm performance. But it works relatively well under a specific set of circumstances. So one is the more homogeneous the business units are, the more similar they are in what they do and the environments that they face, the better off these social comparisons is. Second, it's better in more stable environments, not necessarily only completely stable ones, but not truly dynamic ones. And maybe in my mind, most interesting, it works best when they are complements of one another, when increases in performance for one unit actually helps the same way as well. And the reasons, the underlying mechanism behind these three findings is that the social comparison has two main outcomes. One, it creates what we call a balancing effect. It means that at any given time in the firm is guaranteed to have some resources allocated towards exploration and some towards exploitation. And so it creates this balance where the firm is never all in on one or all in on the other at that point. The second, and this is a little, that's pretty intuitive. The second is a little more complicated, but basically the way this works is it creates more stabilization so that if there's volatility in performance that's idiosyncratic, it doesn't necessarily push the division into exploration the instant that performance drops. It really depends upon whether it's still above or below the other competing unit that it's comparing itself with. Now, the relevance of this, I think to some extent from a practitioner perspective, we're interested in trying to understand whether there are boundary conditions under which it's okay for managers to allow or even kind of encourage managers to benchmark versus one another from that perspective. Now, to get to a little bit of the nitty-gritty details, so at least the true paper trail of the paper looks like this. We first submitted in December of 2014, and with this one we were very lucky. We only submitted it to ASQ. We went through at ASQ through 2 R&Rs to acceptance, but still submitted in 2014, reasonable review time. Then we had 13 months, had to ask for an extension on our 1-year R&R before we resubmitted it in 2016. And then just barely got it in under the wire with the 1-year deadline that ASQ gives you for 2017, accepted at the end of 2017, published at the beginning of 2019 at that point in time. So that's kind of the rough timeline. But if we're going to talk about origins and where it came from, to talk a little bit about ideas and to talk about the overall timeline, the origins actually tied to a different paper, which bizarrely enough came out in almost the exact same month as the paper in ASQ. And that's a paper with Jung-Hyun Seo, and it's about product level feedback to the organization. It's not really about structure, though we do talk a little bit about it. That had an even crazier journey that I won't really go through, but started in 2008. With second R&R rejected one journal, first R&R rejected another, then came out in AMJ, but because it took so long, published at the same time as the ASQ paper. I was presenting this paper in Southern Denmark in 2011. So that's 8 years before the ASQ paper came out. And Nils and Oliver had one-on-ones with me that they combined. So we ended up turning it into a long session that then went into the evening, where we started brainstorming ways to take the classic Leventhal and March model of 1981 and adapt it to a multi-business setting. This idea that, look, we know kind of a little bit about what happens within business units, but if we imagine a multi-business firm, what are the dynamics that are more interesting around that in some way? And we really were interested in how these interactions between business units affected search or performance or kind of the innovation within the organization. And that's really the origin of this paper. There were multiple AOM long drawn out sessions to try and figure out how to deal with reviewer comments and things like that. But that was kind of the start of that paper, was very clearly in that June 2011 conversation with Nils and Oliver. Now, let me talk about challenges. And I want to break this into 2 buckets, but because I know that some of the challenges we faced were very modeling specific and maybe less interesting in some ways to some people, but maybe especially interesting to others. So the review team probably, we don't fully know, but the 3 reviewers and the 1 editor basically had 1 modeler, but the editor and the other 2 reviewers were much more a real benefit for modeling papers. It's maybe a lot more work to try and appeal to an empirically minded audience, but I think in the end, we write better papers when we try and write to a broader audience. And so taking that on, I think for us, created a lot of challenges, partly in describing the model and how it worked, but then also kind of dealing with a number of the kind of very empirically minded questions that came up as part of the review process as well. And this was especially hard because we were building the modeling machinery from scratch, right? So if we were basically able to say this is an NK model, then maybe the reviewers, even if they're empirical, maybe understand how that works. We had to walk through a lot of different pieces. And so there was a lot of work education-wise and explaining-wise around how to do that. I think one of the big things that came out of this was that the reviewers really pushed us hard to talk about mechanisms. And for me, I think one of the key realizations, previous paper with Felipe, but was kind of really honed in this process, was really, why else would you write a modeling paper, in my mind, right? I mean, otherwise, we should be using kind of broad level empirical data to understand what's going on. The reason to go into the lab or to do a model is to try to really understand the mechanism in some way, shape, or form. And so getting to those mechanisms, I think, is especially important in this situation. And I think because of the nature of org design, the org design literature, it may be broader, have more broad import beyond that as well. And I think there was a push for, from the review team for us to develop modeling solutions to kind of things that were maybe obvious or intuitive from an empirical perspective. So there were many reviewer suggestions, and I'll kind of charitably call them that, questions, comments, concerns, whatever, but they end up being suggestions that were amazing, that were really helpful for us. And the best example is honestly when we first submitted the paper, we didn't model downstream whether the divisions were competitors with one another or complements at all. And that was a relatively throwaway style question that came up in the review process that we thought was a great one. And that's why we had to ask for an extension on the modeling, was how do we actually solve this problem and build this into the model? And it was a thing that, you know, it's a comment that isn't necessarily born out of the modeling machinery, but it's born out of the reality that so many multi-business firms, the business units are, usually speaking, complementars. That's kind of why they are in the same organization at any given point in time. From the org design literature, I would say the challenges we faced were mostly around, this gets to a model a bit as well, but what parameters are choice variables and which ones are exogenous? This is often clear in empirical work, or at least clearer in empirical work. And in a model, everything's modeling choice, right? We can model the environment, we can model structure, we can model dynamism, we can model resources, all kinds of things. But it became a question around, well, where are we going to try and focus? Because in the end, we needed to be able to take a complicated, kind of interconnected org design problem, but try and focus it down to a specific set of issues that was tractable as a paper in some ways. And so we ended up doing, I think, what is a typical way to go about this, trying to frame this around the interesting, hopefully coherent, and especially controllable factors. You know, where can managers actually control something? But of course, what's controllable in org design? All the choices we make in org design are big choices. They are long lasting, and they're all endogenous in different ways. And so it's hard to really isolate where to look for from that perspective. We considered different approaches. We had things, as I said, resources, environment, firm size, things like that. We could have talked about which divisions to acquire or divest. I mean, there's any number of ways we could have used the machinery to try and go do this. And our solution, as I said, focused on this choice of kind of encouraging or discouraging social comparisons as a function of everything else going on. There were many potential ways we could have gone about this. It's not always obvious for how to do it and what to kind of lead with. But that was the way we kind of focused on here. And the good thing was we were able to identify other ways in we could have focused on. And Oliver and Song Sui Hu and I are now working on a spin-off project on kind of different allocation processes for headquarters to different divisions that hopefully we'll see in the future at some point in time. So some quick takeaways then from modelers. And here I got to give a hat tip to Dan Leventhal, kind of just, you know, the classic phrase that he's always said, look, there's two ways you can write a modeling paper. One, you make a series of behaviorally plausible assumptions, you aggregate up and you get somewhere cool. And the whole point then is, can I defend these assumptions that I am making along the way? The other way is you go from a stylized fact that says, we've observed this kind of outcome pattern in the real world. Can I explain why and how that happens? And so I'm trying to build the best, maybe the simplest, whatever it might be, model that explains those results. And I think it's important, if you're going to try and write a modeling paper, to figure out which one of these two you're basically trying to do and how you can capitalize on the benefits of doing it. For what it's worth, we were definitely the first one of these. Can we make a set of assumptions about the firm that are based in behavioral research and empirical research? Second, as I said before, making models more relatable to non-modeler audiences, I think is incredibly helpful. It's hard, but I think it actually produces better papers. Again, as I said, getting to mechanism and intuition. In a model, you need to make sure it's not baked in, where basically you make one assumption and that drives everything, unless that assumption is very, very well grounded in empirical fact in that point in time. And last, from presenting the paper many times, writing and rewriting the intro many, many times, examples are a great way to help a reader into a modeling paper. But of course, the minute you give an example, they're like, well, your example doesn't exactly match up with your modeling design. And so it becomes this kind of push and pull back to figure out where and when examples are useful. There was, I swear, 25% of the entire review process was discussing whether, where, and how we could or shouldn't use this GE example that we were kind of using it in the paper. For org design scholars, nearly every org design outcome is long-lasting, historically impacted, and massively endogenous. And to me, that's cool, right? That's the reason, that's one of the fun things about studying org design, is that everything has to be kind of taken in context, and we have to approach it and think about it a little bit differently. But figuring out, well, why would these choices get made? Why would this firm make this choice at any given point in time? I think is especially interesting. Second, if you want to make prescriptions when it comes to org design, you have to talk about boundary conditions. I mean, this is true everywhere, but I think even more so in org design, because there's always going to be really big boundary conditions where a design choice we think, but it might not. It's kind of, we're obliged to at least guess or give some sort of informed perspective on what those boundary conditions might be. Third, org structure, which is kind of the classic way we often talk about org design, is great, but org design is a lot more than that. You know, incentives, communication, information flow, decision-making, and to me, the best part is those interrelationships between all those different pieces that make this the most interesting. I think I got one last thing. So takeaways kind of more generally, and this is maybe stepping away even from the topic here, and this gets to a little bit to kind of finding good questions, but also kind of typical review problems. First one I'll say is don't argue with the existing literature as much as build on it. That's good science. We can disagree with prior literature, but where they are right, we want to be cumulative. And it's a reality of the review process. You're going to be reviewed by the people who are most relevant for your paper. And they often don't like being disagreed with or being told that they did a bad job of doing X or Y. The last on how to find a good research question. I think in general, when you've got an idea, you want to ask yourself, who's the audience who's going to care about and be excited about this and the phenomenon and wants to see the conversation move forward? And what's the real world relevance? Does it offer good prescription? Does it describe a practically important phenomenon? So kind of who's going to care most and why should everyone else care? I think become some of the key ways to try and think about that. I think that's all I have. So let me stop with the sharing.
Thanks, JP. I think you made it in time.
Sorry, I might have been a little bit tight there.
It's fine. You exceeded by a few seconds, but it's all fine. John, over to you.
Okay, thank you, Jay-Ho. Can everybody hear me okay? Cool. Can everybody see the presentation okay?
Okay.
Well, thanks a lot for inviting me today. I'm going to be building on some of the points which JB just discussed, but I'm focusing more on an empirical approach to understanding organizational design, specifically looking at how you go about collecting data to understand this really interesting problem. But by way of introduction, I feel a bit of a fake at this meeting because I haven't published all that much in organizational design. And you might think, who's this guy who looks just like John Oliver that's presenting to you? You go on to Google Scholar and you'll find this. You'll think, is this the same guy? Sonoelectrochemical processes, voltammetry. It is the same guy. Originally, I was a physical scientist. And there is a lot of similarity between sonoelectrochemistry and organizational design, but I think that's for another presentation. Now, coming from a scientific background, what I found really interesting moving into the social sciences was this absolute interest in looking at causality and whether A causes B. And coming from a sort of physical sciences background, we're kind of spoiled. It was kind of assumed that A would lead to B. We had a lot of control in our experiments. And what we were more interested, I mean, causality was nice, but it was pretty easy to show. We're focused around understanding the mechanisms between A and B. That was a lot more important around trying to understand what leads between A and B. And, in this domain, there seems to be a lot of focus around perfect identification. I just want to share a couple of quotes from two leading economists that highlight that, this may be misplaced to a certain extent. The first is by this economist called E.E. Lima. And I think he makes a very powerful point in terms of what we're trying to do. He's talking about patterns and stories accurately conveying our knowledge. It's literature, not science. So to a certain extent, what we're trying to do is in our papers is try and convey a convincing story around how companies structure themselves or design themselves and a range of different outcomes that we're interested in. The second quote comes from a more recent paper by Akerlof in the Journal of Economic Literature in 2020, which talks about this trade-off that scholars find, or economic scholars specifically, between what he calls hard problems and important problems. Hard problems are those which can be solved using your clever econometric techniques where you've got nice identification. It can be a randomized control trial. It can be sort of a natural experiment. And then you've got sort of like important problems, those which, you know, people are really interested in what the solutions are. And they may not necessarily be the same. The economics profession spend a lot of time focusing on hard problems, but not necessarily looking at what he described as interesting problems. So I think this is by way of an interesting background when we talk about org design and the concerns about identification. Now, this probably explains why organizational design sort of was really popular in the sort of like 1970s, 80s, 90s, and then it went through a sort of wilderness period. And there was a really nice piece by these two scholars, Greenwood and Miller, which was an Academy of Management Perspectives, which talked about all of the problems that scholars face when it comes to studying organizational design. And they highlighted, for example, the difficulty in collecting data, the difficulty in trying to come up with unambiguous definitions of causality, for example, and just highlighting it's a very difficult area to study. And probably that could be one of the reasons for why there was a sort of movement of attention away from internal organizational structure design in those late 90s, but now it's sort of taken up and gone through a bit of a resurgence recently through a number of the techniques which we're talking about in today's panel. However, in terms of the, you know, going back to the Akerlof point about sort of interesting versus hard, so, okay, it may not be able to be addressed using all of these hard econometric techniques, but it is a really important problem. So I've got two quotes here from two CEOs I'm sure you're familiar with. I think the first quote by Satya Nadella, I think you'd all agree with, that structure is super important. That came from an interview you had with McKinsey. And the quote by Mark Zuckerberg highlights, you know, the importance of organizational structure when it comes to actually producing new products which customers want. So we are tackling a super important problem. But the limitation may be we may not be able to address it using those hard techniques. So how do we empirically examine organizational design? So I've used this maybe unfamiliar construct called the Steve Jobs facial scale to try and look at this particular problem. So the first one, what would be ideal would be that you could ask a random sample of 100 S&P 500 companies to change their structure. The other 100 keep their structure at Y. And if you can do that, I'll be particularly impressed with you and buy you a beer at the next AOM. Else, you know, I think you probably get the reaction from Steve Jobs in that first picture of sort of like laughter and bemusement. So what do we do next? Then, you know, we've got in the real world, we're dealing with a whole bunch of observational data. And that's got all the usual disadvantages. We've got selection issues. You can only, you know, collect data on certain companies, and there obviously could be selection bias. There's all these unobserved variables that we can't see within these organizations, and the data is generally incomplete. So you've got Steve Jobs there looking a bit confused, not looking too happy. And then finally, what you can do though, is you can still examine what I think are interesting correlations. And I think really important, one of the key messages you want to communicate here, and that JP was talking about in the previous presentation, is evaluate some important mechanisms by which organizational structure can impact a range of outcomes of interest. And you can understand, more importantly, what the challenges are that managers in organizations face when they're designing their companies to address specific goals. So it may not be perfect, but it's a lot better than just, you know, sort of like focusing on observational data in isolation. So he gets a Steve Jobs sort of forced smile look, the sort of look that he would give, you know, when he has to put Microsoft Office onto his Apple operating system. So today I'm going to be talking about a couple of ways in which you can collect structural data. The first of which is more historical. If you look through the organizational design literature, a lot of papers back in the 60s and 70s tended to focus their effort in collecting data around surveys of managers in organizations. So you're probably familiar with these sorts of papers. A lot of the focus was around, you know, managers' interpretation of their structures, collecting data on sort of like Likert scales around the agreement around how formalized is your structure, how bureaucratic, how centralized or decentralized is the structure. So it was all based on perceptions of managers collecting using survey data. And you know, a lot of great work has come out of that. I'm sure you're all familiar with the book by Chandler, Strategy and Structure, 4 very detailed case studies of leading organizations. Secondly, more recently, the focus has moved to collecting data on organizational structure from companies' org charts, and that's what I'm really going to be focusing on today. So a big shout out to Daniel Albert, his org science paper in 2018, looking at European banks. And there's also an org science paper by Whittington and Girard, which focuses around Fortune 50 companies, where they spend a lot of time collecting this data on companies' structures from public reports around top management team, for example, and what the roles are, and try to interpret what the structure of these organizations are. And then finally, a couple of recent papers, more in the innovation space, have looked at using indirect structural proxies. So the paper by Nick Argyris and Brian Silverman, they had a sort of combination of survey data where they looked at the number of employees in R&D labs, which were corporate labs as opposed to R&D labs in business units, and tried to infer from a ratio of the two numbers of managers what the degree of centralization of R&D was. And then the paper by Ashish Arora, Belenzon, and Luis Rios looked at patent assignments and looked at whether the patent was assigned to the actual corporate parent of an organization or a business unit, and again, came up with some measure of decentralization of research and development. But today I'm going to be primarily focusing on these first two. So there's a lot of information on this slide, but I think it's helpful in terms of trying to understand where you can find this data. A lot of the management data, you'll be amazed that the annual reports, 10Ks, 20Fs, the financial filings that companies make with the SEC do contain quite a lot of information about both direct reports to the CEO. Some companies have data on levels below the direct reports to the CEO, so N2 level and below. Some of the work that Daniel, for example, mentioned, I mentioned earlier, looked at operating segments, so how companies divide up their business and the financial reporting. And there's a lot in the description in letters to shareholders about companies, especially if they've made a fairly large restructure. So that is primary data which you can go out and collect. For example, in my dissertation, I spent about a year collecting 900 firm years worth of data across 49 companies in the pharmaceutical sector. It's quite time consuming, it's quite tedious, but you can get a lot of interesting information. There's a whole bunch of databases out there which have got this organizational data about the top management team roles, which are worth looking at. LexisNexis Corporate Affiliations is particularly good. They have a timeline of data, so for some companies it can go back as far as 10 or 20 years, what the different managers are at different roles. Plus they have the subsidiary structure at great levels of detail. And there's a whole bunch of other databases as well. I'm not going to be talking about this today, but there's a lot of interesting work being done using, for example, machine learning techniques to actually take these annual reports and extract interesting patterns in terms of what the organizational structure can be. You train up on a subset of company annual reports around these companies telling you all centralized and decentralized, and then you use machine learning to apply that to the other annual reports and get measures of company structure. I just want to say, in terms of interviews are really important. I think this really important to supplement your structural data. And I think there's a couple of reasons for that. First of all, it's really important to use interviews to validate your structure. You're interpreting the structure based on reports from the annual report. So it's good to speak to some people within the organization, make sure you've interpreted it correctly. It's good to understand the mechanisms leading your organizational structure to your outcomes. And I think it really adds credibility to your arguments as well. I thought, it would behoove me to think about, surveys to collect structural data. It's quite time consuming, but I think there's a few pieces of advice I want to share here. I think if you are thinking of doing a survey to collect data from organizations, I think it's worth partnering up with an industry organizational consulting firm that may have the partnerships with those different industries. For example, my advisor did a survey of for example, the semiconductor industry with a semiconductor industry body, and it saved a lot of time and hassle. I think it's really important that you highlight for companies what the value is for them doing this particular survey, and for example, providing them a benchmarking report at the end. And I think finally, it's really important to try and understand who in the organization is going to be completing this survey for you. I found, in my experience, the corporate strategy teams are usually helpful to do this sort of work. And I think it's a really important balancing act here between, one is collecting original data, you get the originality, but then the cost associated with that is the time. So you can collect data from a database, it's more generic, takes less time, versus collecting original data, which can be quite time consuming. Another thought is around sort of theory. You know, we've got this tricky balancing act around simplicity versus complexity. I think it's really important as you're developing the theory is focusing on limiting your assumptions, making sure that it's easy to follow, but it's complex enough and interesting enough where you've got interesting hypotheses and the theory is sufficiently differentiated from the existing literature. So another trade-off we're trying to address here is between making sure your theory is as simple as possible, so you're limiting assumptions, but it's interesting enough where the hypotheses are differentiated from what we see in the literature and people can say, huh, that's interesting. I just want to close with just a brief example of some of my work where I applied these processes, where I was looking at the relationship between organizational design and firms' innovation outcomes. Organizational design, I looked at whether R&D and firms' overall organizational structure are centralized. And then the mechanisms which I looked at linking the R&D structure and the organizational structure to the firm's outcomes around innovations were around knowledge flows and incentives. And the outcomes I was looking at, I broke up the innovation process into upstream invention, the creation of new ideas, development, conversion them to final products, and then finally commercialization. But here I just focused on the first two stages, invention and development. In terms of my R&D structure, I focused on decentralization of R&D, basically looking at whether there was a single research and development head in the organization or multiple heads. It was just a dichotomous variable. If you had multiple heads, it was decentralized, set at 1. If you had a single head, it was set at 0. And again, confirming those with interviews. In terms of corporate decentralization, what I used there was focused around the whether the organization had 3 different roles, whether you had business unit roles, administrative functional roles, or product functional roles. And then what I looked at there was the ratio of the business unit roles to those 3 other types of roles. So business unit roles, they have P&L responsibility for a specific business unit. Administrative functional roles, do you have, HR, you're head of some sort of administrative group like HR and finance. And then finally, product functional roles are very much focused on the primary value chain. Is it R&D, sales, and marketing? So the more business unit roles you have in the organization, the more decentralized the organization is. And this comes directly from companies' top management teams. So what did I find? In terms of invention, you've got this trade-off between the quantity of inventions. The more decentralized you are, you create more inventions. However, the more centralized you are, the more original and novel those inventions are. And what really comes out of this is the mechanisms from the interviews. Why we get more inventions when you decentralize is because it ramps up incentives. It's much clearer who's responsible for what R&D project. You can use higher powered incentives. And as a result of that, you can incentivize managers and you can create far more inventions when you're decentralized. But when you centralize, you can enhance knowledge flows. You haven't got these internal barriers, greater communication between different business units. And as a result of that, you get much higher knowledge flows, much richer new inventions. And then just in terms of development, what we find is in the earlier stages of development, again, R&D centralization helps because you've got those rich knowledge flows to address complex technical problems. And then finally, in terms of the later stages of development, it helps to be decentralized on a corporate scale. And that's because those higher incentives, you solve all the complex technical problems. It's not about knowledge flows, it's about incentives. So I know I'm running out of time. I just want to summarize 3 final points. I know there's a lot communicated here today. The first point is, don't worry if you can't achieve perfect identification. Sometimes it can be a bit of a fool's errand, especially in social sciences. Even, field experiments are limited in terms of being able to identify causality. Lab experiments, of course, excluded. You've got a high degree of control there. But even if you do achieve that goal of identifying causality, I think it's really important that you supplement your findings with other data and analyses. Second point is, just because you can't find perfect identification doesn't mean do a dodgy job. What's really important there is you've got a very good theory that you've crafted a good and convincing story behind. And you think carefully about the mechanisms by which A leads to B, by which organizational structure leads to a specific outcome, and look for those interesting theoretical tensions, for example, between incentives and knowledge flows. And then finally, there's a lot of data out there. People, what was discussed around that sort of AMP paper, which I talked about, was the lack of data on org structure. There is actually a lot of data out there we can get from publicly available databases or that you can collect from a range of data sources. But I think it's really important that you conduct interviews with industry practitioners as well to build on the mechanisms which you're looking at. And it's also, you know, just the final message which I want to communicate. It's all about telling a good story and making sure all of these pieces come together for you to come up with a convincing story around how organizational structure or design impacts the outcomes you're interested in. Sorry, I probably overran there, but I think I've got through everything.
Thanks, John. Now let's have Daniel.
Stop sharing.
Can everybody hear me okay? Cool. Hi, my name is Daniel. I'm an assistant professor at Columbia Business School. So I was asked to provide some perspectives on using multi-methods from publishing my one multi-method paper. But there's this wonderful article by Jim March on learning from a sample of one or even fewer. And I think Jim March also was a firm believer that people learn from failures. And if that's the case, based on the number of rejection letters I've received attempting multi-methods, I have a lot to share today. So when we say multi-method, we really mean two methods, typically a field study plus one or two experiments. And I only know of one three-method study. It's by Marcus Reitzig that combines a field study with a formal model and an experiment. So why multi-method? Well, because one method is sometimes not enough. So I think JP and John already talked about this, but structure is an extremely endogenous variable. So we typically study how structure affects certain outcomes, such as creativity or performance. But we're also familiar with the saying that structure follows strategy, which blesses us with the textbook example of reverse causality. So we have to deal with the indigeneity, but collecting structure data is extremely difficult. I think John already talked a lot about this, that structure data is usually a small sample, collected through surveys or more recently by scraping managerial titles. And it's almost always non-panel. And for 7 years, I've been looking for a natural experiment that provides exogenous variation in a firm's org structure, but have failed so far. Now, which really throws all of the modern econometric techniques out the window. Matching doesn't work so well either for reasons I won't go into today. So to cope with this indigeneity and the limitations of our ability to measure structure, most studies look at variations in the dependent variable. So for example, they look across, they look for differential effects on incremental versus radical projects, new versus old projects, trendy versus basic products. But adding an experiment helps us get there, to get to the underlying mechanism, to fill out this Coleman's boat. So for example, organic structure better supports innovation. I think that's pretty boring statement to make. But if you say that because it promotes flexibility, which encourages exploration, which results in more innovation, then you can present a much more convincing story. And this gray box is what you're really after, both theoretically and empirically. And adding an experiment helps you unpack this black box. So any other reasons to do multi-method, other than getting deeper insight about the mechanisms? It's not double the work and pain. I would say it's at least triple the work and pain. But I can think of two additional reasons why you try to combine a field study with one or two experiments. So first, I did it for causality, that I would prove that my findings and mechanisms hold in a random assignment setting. But turns out, it is actually a surprisingly mediocre reason to do a multi-method. So some topics like corporate governance or labor economics as an entire field, it's all about causality. If you can't solve this, you shouldn't start the project. But I don't think that's the case with structure research. We should ask JP and Maggie later. But I think AEs and most reviewers, they understand that natural experiments on org structure are just not likely. Again, I've been trying for 7 years and haven't found one yet. But as long as you explicitly admit the key concerns and deal with them to the best extent that you can with the data you have, my impression is that most reviewers will be okay with it. And if your experiment is mostly about causality, I'm assure you that there's high chance that it gets appendixed. So causality should not be the driving reason why you should be tacking on experiment to your field study. And second, I think this is actually a surprisingly great reason to do a multi-method, is that you can be very precise about what you're measuring. So structure is a multi-dimensional construct, and everyone talks about it and thinks about it very differently. So, I mean, there's hierarchy of authority, there's centralization, formalization, specialization, and when someone considers a mechanistic, when someone thinks about a structure as being organic, others will consider that to be organic and vice versa. And there's also this annoying difference between administrative structure versus perceived structure. So administrative structure is basically what you see on the org chart. So the number of layers or approvals you need to get to the top. Perceived structure is how people feel about how bureaucratic their organization is. So people get at the administrative structure by scraping titles or looking at org charts and counting the number of boxes. You get a perceived structure, typically using a survey. And often they don't converge at all. So for example, if you look at administrative structure of Apple or Samsung, it'll be extremely tall hierarchy. But when Apple really wants to push something quickly and something that's important, they'll establish a separate team in a skunk type of arrangement that directly reports to Tim Cook, and it's not hierarchical at all. So I never seen a reviewer letter that does not question whether your empirical context really measures the specific facet of structure you're theorizing about. It will always come up. And I can promise you that. So, and your field data will most likely underwhelm the reviewers in terms of precision with which you can measure the structure, but you can point them to your experimental study number 2, and they'll buy you a lot of space to talk about, to theorize and to talk about things you want to talk about. So what are the potential pitfalls during the review process? First, I think there's reviewer number 2 will say that your field study and experiments do not map onto each other well. So I really recommend that you start with the field study and then backfit the experiment. Going the other way and trying to backfit the field study just is a lot more difficult. And most likely you will end up with a poor man's version of field study. A second, I think you might get a micro reviewer because there's an experiment. You really want to avoid this at all costs. The way OB scholars think about hierarchy and the underlying behavioral mechanisms is very different. And they also want to test them differently. So there's this risk of you working on sort of mediated moderation or moderated mediation at 3 a.m. With tears in your eyes. And there are reasons why micro papers have 6 to 7 experiments. So, I mean, there are different ways you can do this, but maybe it's partly about framing. It's partly about your citations. It's partly about signaling on the cover letter that make sure that you're dealing with macro aspects of org structure, because again, it's a topic that OB scholars are interested in as well. And lastly, we are not very good at running experiments. It seems simple, but it's a very deep method, and I really recommend that you find a co-author with the expertise. Although there's a little bit of risk that they would want to turn the paper into an OB paper. So maybe you may ask, am I saying that don't do multi-method? But I do think that it allows you to tackle research questions that are extremely important and also under-researched. So very crudely speaking, and it's just a mental categorization I use, I think there are 3 substrands of structural research. There's this classic aggregation dynamics done by people like Dan Leventhal, Thorbian, Fanish, Felipe. And second, there is this behavioral research that looks at behavioral biases related to structural choices. This strand tends to use experiments a lot. So my research belongs to this category, along with Marcus Reitzig, Hennings at INSEAD, and Ronnie Lee. And third, there's this corporate structure research that deals with incentives and coordination costs. And they're they're done by Maggie, Samina, John Joseph, and also JP in this regard. And for what it's worth, and again, coming from a guy with one publication on structure, I think that future structure research is about conversations across these three buckets. So for example, Hennings at INSEAD has a really fun paper that looks at how voting rules can generate behavioral biases. Philippe has a working paper that looks at how different org structure can compensate for flawed mental models. Again, they have very behavioral underpinnings to their argument, and being able to observe them and test them directly via experiment will get you a long way. And I have working papers that look at how multi-divisional structure gives rise to political infights. And another project that looks at how specialization, by giving managers a sharper but also narrower mental model, creates biases against novel ideas. And the fact that you can actually be able to measure these biases in a very highly controlled setting in a random assignment is extremely powerful. And I think making structure the dependent variable is extremely important, but very difficult. And we have very few studies on this topic. Again, if you look through structure research, you will find that structure is the IV. It's rarely the DV. It's largely because of data-related reasons. But I think my colleagues at Columbia, Stefan Meyer and colleagues, have this wonderful paper that combines a formal model with experiments to show that high trust culture leads to decentralization. To conclude, I think structure research is really difficult. Compared to my other research streams, I think the bar is higher, partly because of the data challenges and nailing down endogeneity and getting a causality. But it's also extremely important, I think. I mean, just think about the US response to COVID testing, right? The entire country debated for a whole month on whether it should be centralized and done by federal government or decentralized. I think we're still working on the question, unfortunately. It's also a research topic that's interesting to economists, sociologists, OT people, strategy, and also psychologists as well. So it is an extremely broad appeal. But perhaps the most encouraging thing is that we have a very supportive community with AEs who want to accept papers on org structure. They will try really hard not to send it to OB reviewers unless you really mess up the framing. And I don't think I can say the same thing about research streams where the default mode is to reject. So I really encourage you to explore structure and consider using a multi-method approach.
Thank you, Daniel. Thank you for making it in time. Now, finally, let's have Maggie.
Great. Let me share my screen.
Daniel, I think you need to unshare your screen first.
Let me do that quickly. Let's see.
Do you see my screen now?
Very good.
Okay, good. All right. Thank you, everybody, for joining this conversation. I think it's pretty amazing how different kinds of organizations that adapt quickly to online conference and communication and collaboration, which I think is an interesting question in org design by itself. So when I was asked to talk about how to publish papers in org design, I reflect on the 15 years, which I have tried to write papers in this area. I think the research on org design today is very different from research 15 years ago when I first started this. I think 15 years ago we had many groundbreaking theoretical papers on org design. The test of these great ideas is mostly through computer simulation, due to not only lack of data, but also lack of operationalization of some of the key concepts. And today we have many, many more great empirical papers in this field. Still, I see, there's still challenges in this area. So I'd like to share some of my thoughts on this. So I have only a few slides, which will bring us back in time, I think. All right, so I think, it doesn't matter if you are just writing an empirical paper. The lesson I learned over the years as a writer, as a reviewer, as an editor, is that you need a strong, good, solid front end. So even for empirical paper, you have to ask research questions that are of fundamental interest to management scholars. If you think you're writing to a strategy or OT audience, you have to think, what are the decisions that these authors or these scholars would be most interested in? And think even more broadly, the policymakers and the managers, what are the decisions they have to make on a day-to-day basis? And can your research question help address their concerns? And in asking your research questions, please pay attention to boundary conditions of the existing theories and the trade-offs really facing the decision makers. If, for example, related diversification is good, why don't we see all firms doing related diversification? If centralization or decentralization is the optimal solution under certain environmental condition, why do we see firms swing between centralization, decentralization, even when the external environment does not change? Could it be that neither centralization nor decentralization is the optimal solution? Firms are just switching from one mode to another with the expectation that on average they will hit or they will be able to approximate the optimal design. So these are, I think, interesting questions can promote thoughtful research questions. Second is to develop a solid framing for your paper, even if it's an empirical paper. Try to bridge broader strands of literature so that your paper can be read by a broad audience. So think about strategy. Even if you're writing an org design paper, can your paper be related to resources, of the firm? Can it be related to contracting between firms? Can it be related to incentives within firms? Can it be related to competitive dynamics between firms? Certain variables are of keen interest to scholars in this field, and then try to see if you can make your research relevant to those audience as well. Then I want the next suggestion will be to be very explicit about your assumptions. You have heard from all the speakers before me that structural design is very endogenous. So you have to be very explicit in your paper what you have assumed to be exogenous and what have you been allowed to be endogenous. So for example, there's a lot of work on complexity and the consequence of complexity. But what about the sources of complexity? Where does interdependence come from? Can you actually write papers in that space? So I think that space is there's still a lot of opportunities in that space to really go into the details and figure out what is causing the complexity and interdependence. The next suggestion will be to keep your theoretical analysis linear and your arguments logical. Do not run into circles when you when you lay out your arguments. And then you need to use precise theoretical constructs. So there's a difference, for example, between diversification and divisionalization. There's a difference between cooperation and coordination costs. There's a difference between incentive and information problems. Try to be very precise and narrow and modest when you argue your theory, right? To be precise. So try to leverage formal models. So I have started to use some formal models in my writing, not necessarily on org design. One on org design, the other one is more in competitive dynamics. I think as the field matures, we are going to look for even rigorous theoretical arguments, and the model often helps. Even if you're not writing a formal model, thinking through a formal model helps developing your theory. And then when you lay out your contribution, be very precise, and you have well-defined contribution. So some problems I see when reading students or other authors' papers is that sometimes people argue in circles, and then people use different terms for the same construct, and I would suggest against that. After all, we're not writing novels. We're not trying to have increased variety in the novel, right? But if you think in a modelist mindset, then the same term, you want to use the same name to call that construct throughout your paper. Don't try to change it too much. That will create confusion. And the last sentence I want to say on this slide is that if you want to write a good empirical paper, read many theoretical papers. It's just that when you want to write a good theory paper, read as many empirical papers as you can, right? So theoretical papers are going to inform your empirical design. So specifically then let's move on to challenges in empirical studies. The first of all, challenges is data collection, right? As John has mentioned. So select context and data that can be tied closely to theoretical questions. So in the earlier days, every time when people talk about complexity, they use size of the organization to measure complexity. And that's not enough, right? In today's world, we need to get to the context that can help you accurately pin down the mechanisms and test your theories. And then if you cannot find that kind of, the new data, try to take a second look at your old data sets, right? Be creative in finding new use of old data sets. For example, this matrix, task matrix you see on the left, you see, this kind of matrix in many papers, right? This can be used to approximate interdependence or modularity. But in reality, where do we find such a data to mimic this kind of setting, right? So before, people have just been using computer simulation. Let's assume there's X, there's no X between these two tasks. So in my dissertation, in my 2011 paper, 2013 paper, I use input-output tables, right, to show, the tasks that move from one unit to another. Later in my software-driven papers, I used shipments between units. So, try to use, data that can get to your construct or can get to your mechanisms as close as possible. The chart on the right, so that was in my 2015 paper, when I look at reassignment of, control rights, right? So you look into multinational firms and then look at how each unit changes its reporting relationship, right? So these are, I wrote this paper using some old data sets, but you just have to be more creative in using those data sets. And then you can also look for granulate operational data. So this is a data set I use for writing 2 SMJ papers. So in this paper, we look at, production, delivery, ordering in one organization. So the N, if you're counting the number of firms, that's just one. It's coming from one of the largest bottling companies in the United States. But it has 260 distribution centers, it has 60 manufacturing bottling plants. So it gives you enough complexity within the organization. So there are many varieties that are produced by this bottling company. So you can see they have to use different equipment, different plants to produce, different product varieties. And then when they ship their products to their customers, for example, to a retail store, they're shelved differently within the store. So this would give you a lot of interesting observations for you to test your mechanisms. So within this paper, we first look at the impact of integration, then we look at the changing organizational structure as shown in the bottom of the slide. All right. Another challenge is to, I think I mentioned this before, to operationalize precisely of the key constructs, right? So when I started, a lot of the operationalization of decision-making and complexity is in the context of micro-level decision problems such as product design and R&D. So how do we take that to real corporations and look at some other decisions? So, for example, if you can get very detailed data, forecasting data. I remember when I was writing that bottling paper, I just used a forecasting bias to say there's an incentive problem. And one of the reviewers very helpfully pointed it out. Well, since you have the forecasting data, why don't you also look at the variance in forecasting, right? So if it's a bias problem, if it's just bias, then maybe that's incentive problem, right? The forecaster has some incentive to bias the numbers. But if it's a variance problem, then that could be an information problem. The forecaster just doesn't have enough information to make a precise forecast. And then you can actually tease apart those two mechanisms very nicely. So I think those are like very very nice, super valuable suggestions from the reviewers. And then when you write your paper, try to be creative, try to be really focused on the phenomena that you're studying, and then the theoretical mechanisms you're trying to tease out, and then see if there are creative ways to help you design and test those mechanisms. And then different problems will be involved in production, delivery, and then the complexity and the coordination problems, the design problems will be different in all these different stages and different activities within the organization. So try to pay attention to these details. In the current project, I'm working on, within I think 30 to 50 chains, 30 to 50 restaurants within a chain. So we have table level, menu level data. So for every service, we know who the servers are, what the customers have ordered, how long it takes for the servers to serve, what is the tip. And then we just look at this data, and then we look at table assignments, and we look at new orders to capture interdependence. For example, meal orders, some customers might order beverage, their main dish, but also dessert. So that means the server needs to coordinate with the kitchen, with the bar, and then the dessert staff, right? So there's a lot of coordination. We also use this data to look at co-serving when one table gets when there are too many consumers at a table. How do different waiters and waitress collaborate with each other? So that would help us pin down some of the incentives and cooperation problems in org design, right? The third challenge will be methodology issues. So identification has already been pointed out by previous speakers that it's a big problem in this field. And one solution is to leverage exogenous shocks. For example, I think leverage broad scope general shocks not only helps your empirical design, it actually helps you to rethink some of the theoretical problems. For example, when we think about interdependence, when we think about coordination, we tend to think when resources are constrained. And one unit needs this resource, but other unit also needs the same resources, right? So then they have to coordinate or cooperate. I think more work needs to be done in the cases when we have a negative shock, right? Suddenly I have a lot of extra resources. Now do I divest? Well, if I divest one unit or one activity, is that going to influence my performance for other activities, assuming that there's some synergies to start with, right? So what is the implication? So for example, many people have talked about, I think some audience members have also asked what is our thought on how to use COVID-19 as a shock for studies on org design. So I think COVID-19 would cause, first of all, COVID-19 would cause a negative shock that would give us some interesting thoughts about how organizations are going to behave differently when they face a positive shock, right? Or a resource shocking that would constrain their resources. Now COVID-19 probably will cause a shock that would lead to extra resources, right? So that's one thing that's different about COVID-19. But I also would want to caution against using these general broad scope shocks, because in those shocks, so many other parts are going to move within organizations. And that actually does not help us identify a precise link or precise mechanism, right? I myself have used many shocks that are more micro. So even when I only look at one organization, so for example, that paper on bottling companies, I only look at one company, and that, you could say that's n equals to 1. But as I said, within that one company, there are 300 distribution centers, there are 60 plants, there are 3,000 SKUs in terms of product varieties. And one of the two soft drink papers, we looked at the integration, so before and post integration. So this is a shock to the whole organization. But if you think in greater detail, right? So there's some business units that are closer to the headquarters. Some business units are further away, geographically further away from the headquarters. So if we think about monitoring cost, if we think about information cost, if we think about communication cost, before and after, some units are going to benefit more than others. So maybe the units that are further away are going to benefit more from integration. The detail of the reasoning is in my paper. But the point is that, you know, even within one single company, you can look at different organizations of different units and different activities. And different activities and different units could be subject to different shocks, different aspects of this grand shock, right? We also, in the paper, we also, you know, investigate, right? So if there's a hub, if there's some kind of a organizational center where, which would coordinate across certain business units. So we investigate when the shock happens, you know, there could be traffic jams, there could be weather shocks, right? That would influence the demand for soft drinks. Whether that shock happened to a unit that's upstream to this coordination unit, or whether that's a shock happening in this coordination unit, in the region of this coordination unit, or if it's a shock that's happening in the environment in a downstream unit. So these different shocks are going to cause different coordination problems for the coordination unit. So these are, I think, some examples there you can, some examples of you know, how you can leverage a seemingly common shock, but try to tease out a different impact across different units. My next suggestion in methodology is to take advantage of methods developed in other disciplines. So for example, on the left, you know, this is in my 2013 paper. So back then, there's a lot of discussion about modularity. And then, you know, how do we measure modularity? How do we measure decomposability? I think, you know, a lot of papers at that time was to look at two nodes. Okay, can we separate the two nodes or not? And we think that's modularity. So what I did was I used a methodology that's called simulated annealing, that's developed in physics, network analysis, and computer science. So basically, if you have, you know, these links approximated by, let's say, input-output relationships between these nodes, and then you can have the computer simulate to come up with the best clustering structure, which would allow more linkages within each cluster, and then fewer linkages between the clusters. So you can, if you compare A and B, then you know the task structure in picture A is more decomposable because there's a way for the computer to find out a way to build 3 clusters out of this task structure, whereas the task structure in graph B is not so decomposable because the computer has tried. And the best the computer can come up with is this kind of structure. And obviously there's no clear cluster, right, within this network. And the graph on the right is some methodology I have borrowed heavily from the operations literature on stockouts, right? So how do you decide your inventory level? How do you forecast? How do you distribute? And then you borrow models from those fields to see, you know, within this particular organization, which part has failed. So that would inform you, inform your study. One interesting thing about, you know, talking about publication, one interesting piece of information I'd like to share about this soft drink paper is that I originally submit one manuscript to management science. I got 3 reviewers, 2 in strategy and 1 in operations. All 3 reviewers are super interested in the paper, and then they say, you know, this fits management science perfectly because it straddles between strategy and operations. And the operations reviewer was so excited that he gave me a lot of like references in operations to help me solve this problem. So when I took that suggestion, I changed my paper significantly to satisfy those requirements. But after I sent my paper back to management science, the paper was, the operations reviewer was not available for review the paper. So only the 2 strategy reviewers got to review the revision. And the paper was rejected under the grounds that this paper has become too operational, too much. This paper has, you know, be changed such that it looks too much like an operations paper. So then I decided to split the paper into 2, one only about integration, and the other one is org structure. And then I reduced the operations part you know, in the paper, but still leveraging some key ideas in operations. And that paper, the original manuscript came out as 2 separate papers in SMJ. So I learned a great deal by learning these, from learning methodologies in these other disciplines. So that's all I have to share today. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Maggie. And thanks all the panelists for the great presentations. Now we're about to have an open Q&A discussion, having comments and questions from the floor. But before we get onto those comments and questions and let them think about it, panelists, I ask you to kind of like comment on each other about your presentations, just to kind of like make some time for the participants to, you know, think about their questions and comments. John and JP, you may unmute yourself.
I volunteer JP, so.
I mean, you know, well, the cheating thing, right, is obviously that endogeneity was the main thread across all these things. And maybe I'll try and leave that. I do think that there's, I don't know if there's an echo, if that's just me, but there's a lot of ways in which many of these things dealt with the difficulties in getting data, right? I mean, how do you really try and get at ways to measure these specific constructs? You know, I probably took the easiest way out. Modeling means I don't have to worry about that. And so maybe I'm the cheater from this perspective. But I think this even more in some ways than the endogeneity thing becomes a real question for people looking at org design, because it's so hard to see what goes on inside firms. And yes, there are different ways to measure these constructs. And John did a really nice job, I think, of laying out some ways that people have done this in the past. And Maggie going through it in great detail, ways that she's tried to go about this. But it's so hard to get the data that we want to do this. It's really daunting. And I think that's one of the things that it's an amazing opportunity. Like when you can find cool data, there's like, everyone gets excited. Everyone wants to see what you've got out of that and things like that. But it is incredibly tough. And I think there's a real question for how you want to try and go about doing this. And I think, you know, with that in mind, I think even though Daniel was the one specifically talking about multi-method, I think what you're finding is that all of us have gone about multi-methods to try and do this. John talking about the interviews and surveys as ways to validate kind of org charts. Daniel specifically looking at experiments. Maggie was bringing up the formal models. You know, even though I'm here talking about modeling papers, my other work that's looked at structure has spanned across, you know, qualitative and large-scale empirical, and like it's all just trying to pick away little pieces of it because it's so hard to get that whole picture at the same time. So, you know, I think probably many people came to this PDW hoping we were going to have some silver bullet for how to solve that problem. I don't think it's there, but I think what you've seen is a lot of good creative ways to work hard to try and find ways to solve this. How'd I do for being cold called, Daniel?
Awesome.
I'm happy to share some. So what I was thinking of was that what was interesting across these presentations, obviously, as JP mentioned, the endogeneity issue, let's not talk about that. But what I thought was kind of interesting, we talk about, you know, org structure, org design. I think JP made this distinction. But ultimately, you know, especially taking it from the viewpoint of being an empiricist, is that you have to boil down this structure down to, you know, sort of a tangible, measurable variable. And that's a challenge in itself. So I, you know, quickly talked about my work where I focused around centralization, where you're trying to nut it down to one measure. And I think, you know, Maggie's looked at a whole bunch of measures around complexity, for example, and Daniel was mentioning different measures. I think that's a real challenge, as well as collecting the data, is then distilling it all down to a set of measures which are both credible with the reviewers and also of relevance to the organizations which you're studying. So, you know, is boiling down everything to a centralization measure a realistic way of looking at an organization? I think it can give you some interesting sort of like trends which are of relevance, but it, you know, it takes away a lot of the subtlety of organizational design, because, you know, organizations have got all these different unique attributes associated with them, and boiling them down to a single measure can be really challenging. But in order to look at this scientifically, you've got to do that. So it's thinking about, you know, how you construct that measure, thinking of a way in which you can defend that measure, and also making sure that that measure is relevant. And that takes some time and thought. You can build it on the previous literature, or you can try and come up with something which is quite interesting. But, you know, I found that personally challenging, is that you can collect this data, but then you have to distill it down in some way.
I would think, you know, I think some of the endogeneity problem comes from, I mean, might not be all bad, in a way that organizational structures are not super fluid, right? Once you set up a structure, it stays there for some time. And that in itself actually provides some exogeneity for other activities that are more fluid, right? So the structure is fixed there. So when you think about structure, you might think, you know, the impact of structure on different members within organizations, on members that have been there for a long time when the structure was already, the members who have been there before the structure was set up. And you would say, you can say, you know, there's some endogeneity there. But you can also think about the members who joined very recently, who were just, you know, not voluntarily, who did not voluntarily join the structure. And then the impact of structure on these two groups of members should be different. So I think it's challenging, but still, I think there's also opportunities.
Daniel, actually, there was a question that from Mingji that came in the chat on matching specifically. And since I know you briefly mentioned it before, maybe, I don't know if you want to, I'll cold call you back, right? Do you want to try and take this question, or at least take a start at that?
I'm sure. So I tried matching on org structure, but there are multiple challenges, and also matching becomes much less credible when it comes to matching on extremely sticky variables. So going back to Maggie's comment just now, that if you're matching, so it's like this T+0, and they've decided on hierarchical and non-hierarchical structure, and this is T+100. And they're still maintaining the structure for a long time. And the presumption is that their structural choices affected many other variables, that even if you match on structure, or if you try to match on every other observable characteristics, the idea is that there's a residual unobserved differences that remain. So propensity matching or advanced versions of it, the idea is that you want to match on variables that there's a healthy amount of churn. It's not something too sticky. I think there's a lot of underlying assumption that's baked into using, again, different versions of matching. Again, just because structure is so sticky, I think you will have a hard time convincing reviewers that PSM is the right approach to go about this.
Yeah, I'd just like to add to Daniel's point. I've used previously propensity score matching, coarse and exact matching. There's a whole host of limitations, as Daniel was saying. You know, certainly my data, the organizational structures are sticky over a period of time. So even using firm fixed effects, you can fall into all sorts of traps, because you might end up looking at a very small subsample of firms which change their structure over a period of time. You know, just my own experiences going through the review process, not entirely successful, is that depending on the reviewers, sometimes, you know, propensity score, coarse and exact matching might be sufficient if they're more interested in other aspects beyond causality, you know, talking about mechanisms and understanding the mechanisms, and it might be a way of providing an extra degree of confidence. But generally, if you get those reviewers which are, you know, concerned about causality, it's just not going to work with them. And, you know, the experience I've had is that the reviewers will ask at least for you to try and find an instrument, or try and look for a natural shock and something like that. You know, the matching methods do have their limitations. But I think, you know, in terms of providing another sort of like piece of evidence to support your arguments, I think it's worth doing, but in itself, it's not going to get you through the process.
I'll maybe briefly step on a soapbox on this. I think in general, what you really want to do is you want to be able to identify an empirical relationship that you think is interesting, and then be able to think of all of the alternative explanations that could potentially explain why that relationship exists. And then you want to try and think, what are the ways that I can try and address those? you can go through this beforehand, you can go through it afterwards, right? You don't have, this is not always an afterward. You can say, I'm after this theoretical relationship, what are the problems I'm gonna run into? And so I think to some extent, like PSM or CEM or whatever may be a perfectly good answer, but it really depends upon the problem and it depends upon what you can measure. And so if you can say like, here's the problem I've got, and here's why this approach is the right way, is a good way to try and eliminate that problem, that can be helpful. But you may have multiple problems in any given paper, and you may need multiple approaches to try and deal with that. But I think being able to articulate those problems, talk about them, at least in my experience, look, are there times where admitting those problems to a review team gets you in trouble because you bring up things that they hadn't thought of? Yes, but at the same time, it's going to mean that you're going to publish a better paper in the end, as opposed to trying to hope that you can get through with something that's actually subpar and you feel embarrassed about later when it's exposed that it was badly done. So being honest, being open, displaying it, talking about what you can and can't solve, I think buys, from my point of view as an editor and as a reviewer, buys you a lot of goodwill, at least as being, you know, being forthright about that.
I think we just got one more question from Hui-san. Let's see.
So I actually agree with you that they were worked on by a very different set of people. So if you look at org structure at the team level, the scholars who work on that levels of analysis is very different from people who work on higher levels of aggregation. So Maggie or JP to an extent, to me, works at a higher level versus I think I consider myself working at a more lower levels of analysis.
I would also add, I don't know if this is correct, my intuition is that at the project level, there's more opportunity for random assignment and experiment, right? So you cannot convince Steve Jobs to change the entire organizational structure of Apple, but you might be able to convince him to randomly assign some people to a centralized team and then some people to a, you know, decentralized team. But that's my intuition.
May I actually, sorry.
Go ahead. Go ahead.
Sorry, may I ask a follow-up question? So because a lot of the mechanism that we're talking about in terms of organizational structure seem to apply to both levels. I do agree with you that the research traditions seem to split into two.
I mean, I think to some extent it's about measurement, right? And this gets a little bit to, I think, what Maggie was kind of getting at, that there are ways that you can measure maybe some specific things. I mean, part of it's data, right? I mean, if you get good access to data within a single firm, like Daniel in his paper, I mean, it feels like you can say all kinds of things about that, but you're kind of at that more granular level. If you're trying to go for the cross-firm approach, obviously you're going to have to stay at the high level. The only data you can usually get is usually kind of top management team structure, or, you know, high level kind of design and things like that. So I mean, I certainly feel like there are people who play very much at one or the other. I think a lot of people, you know, including people in this call, are interested across those levels to some extent. I think to some extent what happens though is the other factors that come in beyond simply structure shift as you move across levels. So I think at a more micro level, a lot of times it's around personal interest, it's around interpersonal relationships and things like that. The minute you start going to a higher level, a lot of times kind of the pressures coming from external stakeholders start to play a role. Career concerns, like, you know, these all exist in different ways across the levels, but kind of all those other complexities of org design that go beyond structure tend to shift a little bit as you move across them. And so it's like, hey, if I'm really interested in social comparison and jealousy, maybe it's easier to talk about that one way. And if I'm really interested in kind of incentives or information asymmetry, maybe that's easier to talk about it at a different level. So maybe it gets at kind of what are the other things beyond structure that you're especially interested in.
I see. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for sharing your intuitions. I think it's about time that we now break out to 4 different rooms. I'm first going to randomly assign all the participants into different rooms. Participants, if you have any preference over like which room you want to be, just send me a private message. I'll try to move you around. And yep, let's see. I'm gonna randomly assign you to breakout rooms.
John and I ended up in the same room. Is there a room that doesn't have one of the panelists on it, or is that or was that intentional?
It wasn't intentional, but I think this is, yeah, I think you could use this room.
Oh, just hang out in here?
Yep, yep. It seems like we've lost a lot of participants, but still we have a few sticking around.
I don't know if anyone who's here would like to chat on something, or if I should, or if you should send me back to the other rooms. We can wait and see.
Yeah, we can wait and see. Yeah, this is the first time actually using this breakout feature, so I'm not sure like how smoothly it will work out. Wait. JP, I'm gonna kind of like work on moving people around. If you don't mind, I'll
Yeah, go.
move myself out.
Is this now a breakout room or is this back?
Well, so John and I both ended up in the same breakout room. So I ducked back in here to see if I should be assigned somewhere else. But there wasn't, and so there's still some people hanging out here. We weren't sure if there was questions in here. So I was going to hang out for a bit, but I don't know.
Yeah, because like in breakout room 4 where I was assigned, there was none of the panelists. So probably you should have been assigned to that one. Like, let's see.
Are there still people in there? I can't unassign myself.
Yeah, I can't do it
can.
either. Like I think Jeho can do that. People were leaving that breakout room, so.
Okay, so. I don't know, maybe people are coming back in here instead.
Yeah, seems like it. Hold on.
So I was not sure whether I'm long enough in this room to ask a question, but now I'll just go ahead.
Yeah, I would suggest that we just use this as a breakout room.
Yeah, excellent. So JP, I was interested in, so as you said that those mechanisms you're laying out in your paper kind of developed throughout the review process. And then you also mentioned that like one of the spin-off projects from this earlier paper, yeah, you develop with Oliver as well. I was thinking about whether you thought about testing those mechanisms you were developing in the model empirically, because yeah, I would be very interested in that. And if so, if yeah, you already had an idea how to do it, because I guess that's pretty difficult.
Yeah, and that, I mean, it's a great question, and it's certainly one that I think every modeling paper I've ever worked on has come up in terms of the conversations is like, okay, so how would you test that, right? I mean, just like any theory paper in general, it's a reasonable question to ask. It's funny, I can't remember, but I'm pretty sure there's a paragraph in the discussion section where we talk about it a little bit in there. And actually, as I'm thinking about it now, there was something kind of cool we had as an idea in there, but I can't remember what it was off the top of my head. I have to go back and look. You know, I think I think there are ways to do this, but I think part of it is if there's a relatively easy way to collect data to do the test, you probably shouldn't even be doing a model in the first place, or the model should be used to inform the empirical work. A model can kind of stand alone mostly only when there's a reason why doing an empirical paper around that would be difficult. Unless you do the multi-method thing, right, where it's going to be the model and the empirical together in that case. I think that I think specifically for us, right? I mean, we had two main mechanisms. One was around balancing. That's relatively straightforward, right? So like, and that's pretty intuitive. If you're benchmarking versus other units, you're in any given firm, you're always going to have some units that are doing better than others, and so that's going to affect kind of search behavior. I think this idea that that there is more stickiness to some extent in those sorts of comparisons, and the volatility kind of around aspirational cutoffs is going to be less of an issue. There's going to be less kind of volatility that's going to then force you to kind of abandon technologies faster. That's to me the most potentially interesting way to look at this, kind of thinking about how do you get at that kind of behavior. I could imagine experiments as a way to try to do it, right? At some point, you're really trying to validate a specific mechanism that kind of says that the way that these comparisons play out is just different from the way people think about kind of more traditional measures of performance. But I don't think we had a great example. We did have something around kind of like firms that use internal benchmarking or publish internal data or things like that would do better in these environments versus other environments. That could be another kind of a way to go about this. So I guess maybe that's two ways to go about the empirics. One is to say, here's the mechanisms that we are saying are here. Can we think about ways to test those mechanisms? The other is to take the findings of the model and say, okay, that would then suggest that we should see these types of firms do better in this environment and these types of firms do better in a different environment. And that would be another way to approach it. That the second one is more validating, I guess, the model than it is anything else. I don't know. I mean, I tend to be, this maybe gets a little bit to my personal biases in research. I tend to like to go after a big question that I feel like I can go after relatively well. And then at least mentally and emotionally, I'm done with that question for a while and I'm ready to move on to something else. And I'll often come back, but I don't seem to have the motivation type where it's kind of like, okay, we said this, now what's the logical next step from that in some ways. So maybe that's my own personal problems, my own personal ADHD issues or something like that, that kind of dictates my preferences.
Yeah, thanks a lot. That's very interesting.
Maybe a follow-up question. Something that you mentioned during your presentation was like that it's really important to make, especially formal simulations, relatable to a broader audience, right? And like I fully agree, and that's something that I've experienced myself, like as pushbacks. So you mentioned examples here and there, like to motivate the model, etc. Are there any other tips to make it relatable? Like one thing, like to understand it, but also to increase the likelihood that once it's published, that people actually read it. So I encountered like that there's almost like silos. Like I'm an empiricist, I don't read simulation models. I do qualitative work, I don't read empirical. So what's a way to bring this together, like that people read more across discipline or methods?
I don't know if I have a great answer on that, because I'm pretty sure my 2 modeling papers may be among the least read papers that I've beyond the modeling community to some extent of the papers that I have. I think certainly, and it's funny, the one that Oliver and Songsui and I are working on now, I think will probably be far more broad, should we ever get it published, far more broadly read than the 2 that I've already got, just simply because we're talking about socialist versus capitalist resource allocation questions to some extent. And it's just a sexier topic potentially than some of the other things. I think it gets a little bit to the community, right? I mean, if you're a good scholar looking at resource allocation, you should be willing to look at models and empirical papers on resource allocation. I think the problem is that there's some areas within modeling that mostly there's not a comparable empirical community that's even been interested to some extent. I mean, this has been, I think, one of the problems with, like, in many ways, some of the NK search papers is if it feels like it ends up being an NK search paper and appeals to the NK search community, it's not clear who would really want to read that to some extent. The ones that have done better have tended to be ones that relate clearly to structure. And then at least the structure people who are interested empirically want to read that paper. Or it's around, you know, a specific aspect of innovation or something like that, where you can kind of, where you can find that community that you can kind of tie into in some ways. I don't know. I mean, other than picking a topic, I'm kind of not sure. I mean, to some extent, we went through that with the ASQ paper. Was, you know, we had all these different variables that you build into the model, and you could make any of them the entry point for the paper. But I think we tried to think, well, who would care about this beyond just a modeler, right? Who would find it interesting? And there was enough interest in kind of social comparison dynamics and aspirations that we felt like there was a community we could try to reach out to try and go down this route. You know, you get the Nickerson and Zenger paper, and then the follow-up that Todd had with Tomasa Blage, and the work that, like, Christine Beckman has done. I mean, who was the AE on the paper. This was a way to try and find that broader community to some extent. So you kind of make those choices a little bit around who is that community. And then I think it comes to writing, right? I mean, you got to be willing to actually not just cite a whole bunch of modeling papers in the first paragraph, but actually kind of appeal to that audience and be willing to take what comes back from that point of view, from that perspective. I don't know. I think it really, I don't think you're likely to find that a modeling paper has instant appeal, broadly speaking, but just like an empirical paper may not. But it's really just around what's that community, and is that community a relatively open-minded one, right? We know there's some communities that are pretty closed, right? That mostly just read within the community, and those can be hard to make an impact on. But the ones that are more open and broader, I feel like there's at least a better shot at. I don't know if I have a great answer to that question.
That's helpful. And so to follow up on that, maybe, so what brought you into, like, the modeling community besides all your other work? So what was the main motivation for you?
Well, so, and now we'll go to endogeneity, in the sense of I find that I always tend to think like a modeler when I approach any project. That's just the way my brain seems to work. And I don't know if that's why I ended up with Nikolai Sigelko as my advisor, or if my brain works that way because Nikolai Sigelko was my advisor. I have no idea which one, you know, where the causation runs on that one. Probably a little bit of both. But in the end, I mean, you know, I've only really included a model and sometimes it's more of a verbal model, but, you know, a lot of times there's piles of scratch paper. Should I ever go back to my office? Piles of scratch paper in my office for most projects where there is, like, variations on the formal model that I've kind of built for that paper as a way to try and think about it. And I think as a result, that has made me a good co-author for modeling co-authors, right? So people like Oliver, who kind of very much thinks in terms of models first, Felipe Chazar, who kind of the same kind of a mindset. I think the fact that I am an empiricist who kind of very intuitively understands those models, when you're thinking about how do you diversify your co-author team to bring in a different point of view, like that's a good person to have from that perspective. I don't really know where it came from, to be honest. I mean, I don't have a great answer for it, but kind of a modeling systems thinking perspective has kind of always been the way I've approached a lot of stuff. It's funny, I remember maybe one of the most amazing moments for me as a PhD student was I was at CCC as a student, and Peter Zemsky from INSEAD was the discussant for a set of papers, and they were all 3 or 4, whatever it was, empirical papers. And to my knowledge, he hadn't really had the full papers beforehand, but the people presented, and then he got up and on the board wrote out the 3 formal models for the papers up on the board. Like he kind of created them on the fly. He didn't have slides. He was just like, I'm just going to walk through this. And for me, it was that realization that for any good empirical paper, there is that model sitting behind it that should be, that should be formal. You should be able to formalize that if you really wanted to. Was to me incredibly insightful and helpful as a way to try and think about it. And so it just, my mind just drifts back and forth, like, should we or shouldn't we include a model? Daniel and I have been back and forth on this for, Daniel Kuhn and I have been back and forth on this for a project we've got. Yeah, I don't know. So to me, I don't see there as being all that big of a distinction between them. It's just, is there going to be actual large-scale empirical data, or is the empirical data going to be interviews and anecdotes to some extent?
Thank you. I want to give the opportunity if someone else wants to raise a question. Like the breakout rooms didn't work exactly the way they were supposed to.
I think I'm hopeful the other ones did for the most part. So, but we just ended up back here. So
yeah. Jeho, when should we reemerge?
I was actually going to make an announcement right now. I think the other rooms are working pretty well, and I actually enjoyed your talk between JP and Daniel. So I think you guys actually made a good breakout session.
Francisca had good questions as well. So thanks for coming back and joining us over here. So.
So yeah, I'm gonna make a broad announcement telling people that we're gonna have just 1 or 2 more minutes of breakout and have everyone back into this main room. Meanwhile, you may ask more questions to JP.
If I have another opportunity, then I would
go for it. Go for it.
Okay, I don't want to take anyone else's spot, but so topic-wise, I would be interested in what other things related to org design are you working on or thinking about at the moment? And is there anything particular, you're currently interested in?
So, in all honesty, my answer mostly is I have a crazy administrative role that I have taken on for whatever reason at Stern, and work with a bunch of PhD students. And so my answer mostly is I work on what my PhD students are interested in. That tends to drive a lot of what I pay attention to in a lot of these ways. But that's led me to things like looking at stretch goals and incentives with a former PhD student, looking at, John Eklund and I with a PhD student at Stern have been working on a project, kind of looking at the way in which cognition kind of plays in with the structural elements. I mean, a lot of it for me, I tend not to be interested in structure for structure's sake, right? I'm interested in the interrelationships between structure and other aspects of org design. And like, to me, that's what's most exciting. And so it's like, where can you find those ways to try and interact politics or incentives or information or, whatever else it may be with all of those factors in some way. So I don't know if I have an easy answer on that. Sorry, but I'd be happy to chat some other time if you'd like.
Yeah, great. Thanks a lot.
right. So I think people are coming back to the main room.
I think Jeho set a timer, so he's going to kick everybody back in here in a minute, so, or something.
Okay, yeah.
There'll probably be a flood all at once, and you can tell everybody's back here.
Okay, it seems like everyone's back in the main room. Before I hand the last closing remarks to Daniel Albert, I think it would be great if we could just have a virtual photo shoot so that we could share with the broader STR AOM community. So if you don't mind, could you turn on your camera for just a few seconds? I think like I won't be able to capture everyone that shows up in my screen. I mean, like in the room, but I'll try to take a screenshot across different windows so that I yeah, kind of get a count of like who was in this PDW. So don't be shy. Please turn on your cameras. All right, I think this is as best as we could get. All right, I'm gonna take a photo shoot. Just okay. Let's wait for just 5 more seconds. All right. That's good. Yashwant just joined us. Cool. Taking a photo shoot just now. 3, 2, 1, smile. All right, great. Thank you all. Daniel, the screen is yours.
All right, thank you very much. Before I say a few closing remarks, I would like to take the opportunity to see how the breakout rooms worked and what kind of topics came up. Maybe John, maybe you can start, give us like a brief wrap up, like what kind of topics came up, what you found interesting in your discussions.
Yeah, we had a whole wide-ranging discussion. I think a lot of it was focused around what are interesting topics to investigate in organizational design at the moment. And, you know, I think there were a few really cool ideas that came out of the discussion. I mean, one of the areas is around, we didn't really touch this much, is the overlap between entrepreneurship and strategy. And there was some discussion around how company structures emerge over a period of time. So we discussed there was this gap between, there's a lot of literature around founders and startups and things like that, a lot of literature around established firms, but there's a bit of a gap in the middle. And there's a lot of interest around trying to understand that specific issue. And then the other thing that we talked about was, you know, getting into the nitty-gritty within organizations and some really cool ideas about looking at, you know, sort of more novel organizational structures, especially in areas which, like software services, and how do we go about looking at those? So those are the 2 cool areas we talked about.
Thank you. Daniel, maybe you go next. How did your breakout room work?
So we talked a little bit about COVID and, you know, how whether this, you know, the popularity of Zoom will help to flatten the hierarchy.
All right, thank you. Maggie?
All right, so we briefly talked about three, questions. One is with the development of the shared economy and then platform structure, do we see different directions for research on org design? Are we still going to focus predominantly on within intra-organizational structure, or we will open up our eyes to intra-organizational structural relationship as well? So that was the first question. The second, so after discussion, we felt like there are opportunities. Daniel, I see your cat again. Hi. So there are opportunities both within organization and then between organizations. The second question we talked about was, when you do research on org design and when you are trying hard to get data, do you fix your research question first and then look for the perfect empirical context, or do you just look for data and look for empirical context first and then think about your research question next? And at least based on my personal experience, I had the research question in my mind first, because from my earlier research, I see a weakness in that research. And I was like, I had a secret wish, like I only wish I had that kind of data to study that problem. And then when I came across the data, I was very excited. It will help me to study a research question I had in mind already. The third question we talked about was, we all mentioned endogeneity, and then in strategy or management journals, we are into, we spend most of our effort in hypothesis testing, right? So is there a trade-off between proof of the mechanisms and hypothesis testing, right? So are you done once you proved your hypothesis? And I think on that front, I think it's not enough for you just to prove that your hypotheses are correct, because if you have not fully tested your mechanisms, because I think nowadays most of our theory is about mechanisms rather than the empirical relationship that's reflected in the hypotheses. So you can test your hypotheses either as a second or additional hypothesis, or you can, after you proved your hypothesis, design new tests in your empirical section as a test of your mechanisms. So those are the three big questions we have talked as far as I can remember.
Thank you, Maggie. And Francisca and I had the honor to have a very, a lot of face-to-face time with JP talking about different topics. JP, do you mind saying a few words what we discussed?
Yeah, sure. It was great. Honestly, I think it was interesting thinking about it, because I think the main thread that I would say ran across it was the link between the modeling and the empirics in terms of org design research, and kind of how do you bridge across communities? How do you find good data to test modeling hypotheses? Like, why would you use a model in relation to an empirical paper? All these kind of great questions for a field where models are much more common than they are in many other aspects of strategy. So yeah.
Thank you very much. So I know we're over time. Let me just take 1 minute. First of all, to really thank all the panelists, JP, Maggie, Daniel, and John, for your great presentations. I learned a lot, and I'm sure all the participants learned a lot as well. And what was very interesting to me was that all presentations came back to some sort of talking about mechanisms, right? Again, different ways of dealing with it. And I think that's good news, because depending on what your research question is and your method, there's different ways to approach it, right? John gave us some insights of yeah, you work with observational data, but with interviews you could get a sense of what's going on in the data you find. Maggie gave us great examples from her own research, finding clever data sets that really map onto constructs with the servers in restaurants, etc. I found that very fascinating. JB talked about the power of models that can help with the mechanisms, and how we can bring it back to empirical work. And oftentimes it might even spur from empirical work, as he mentioned, the journey of his ASQ paper. And Daniel, in a way, like combined all of these things and said, like, well, there is room for multi-methods, especially if we look at different layers of questions of org design, but also with a big challenge that combining these two methods or multiple methods bring with it. So thanks again, Daniel, Maggie, JP, and John for your great work. I hope everyone enjoyed it. Send us some feedback if you liked it. And thank you, David, for hosting us and organizing with the STR. Thank you very much.